reaching a moment of truth with the ratification, the pending ratification of the European Constitution. Is it your view that the European project can be influenced enough in a democratic direction, responsibly addressing the huge democratic deficit in the European project, or do you believe that the little platoons, as you characterize the neoconservatives, will simply reject the European project and defeat in some of the national referendum the approval of the Constitution?
Let me repeat the questions from Tom Dusterberg of the Manufacturers Alliance. He's sympathetic to Joao Espada's description of the little platoons, and he wonders whether or not the democracy deficit in the European Union can be overcome through some project of reform, or will the little platoons reject the Constitution in the upcoming national referenda on the subject?
Well, well, that's a tricky question. That's a difficult question. My personal view about this constitutional project is that it is misguided, and we don't really need this constitution, this new constitutional treaty, or actually this new constitution, what's going to be the new constitution. And I could, I could develop on this, but I don't think I'm going to bother you with this. Anyway, I think actually the proposal for the new constitution is headed into a wrong direction, because it aims at emphasizing precisely the supranational nature of the European Union, which I think is one of the problems. So I would, on the other hand, I would defend or be in favor of the strengthening of the national parliaments and the role of national parliaments. I think this is much more, even more prudent and more cautious in terms of what the European Union can become in the future. Now that is an enlarged European Union with 25 members, I think there are further reasons to be skeptical about these steps into the supranational direction, and there are further reasons to be in favor of strengthening the national parliaments. Okay, having said that, you also ask the question whether or not, what will people do? I mean, will people ratify the project or not? That, of course, I can't predict. I can't predict, really, of course, but I think you can. The only thing I would like to say, is that, for instance, take the example of Portugal, Spain, these newcomers, I mean, not newcomers anymore, but I mean, countries that joined the European Union in the mid-80s, as I recall, they are very sort of open to this supranational development, not because they are in favor of a supranational European Union, but because they perceive the European Union as a sort of insurance guarantee, life insurance for their own democracies. And I think that's true too. So I am in favor of the European Union. I've been in favor of the European Union, but not as a supranational, unaccountable entity, as a sort of club of nations. So my point would be that many people in Europe will probably vote for the treaty, not because they are in favor of a supranational entity, but because they think that this is necessary to preserve the European Union. I don't think it is necessary, and let's see what happens.
Well, my ambition about the Constitution is that Judge Bork would sit down with it one day or week and really tell us what he thinks of it, clause by clause. This is a 280-page monstrosity, which includes the European song. The Constitution, our Constitution, is designed to limit the role of the state relative to the individual, and this is designed to expand the role of the state for the individual. Can the project be made more democratic? No, it can't. Will the Constitution pass? It needs every country, it needs a majority to pass it. It will not pass in Britain. But that will not be of great, you know Britain better than I, not a chance. 70-30, maybe it's going to go down. Tony Blair is counting on his presidency of the EU starting in July to get people to love Europe, but that's not going to happen in Britain because they're literate. I do think, however, that that will not be as consequential as people think. This is a very resilient project with people devoted to it. And the fact that it goes down in Britain and maybe now in Holland, I don't know, they will regroup and do something else. I think the fact that it's popular in Spain, for instance, among the courageous government in Spain and the elites there, follow the money. I mean, there's been a net flow of EU funds to the countries that love it the most, Ireland, Spain, and so on. And now people are getting very nervous. I don't think the Constitution will be adopted in its present form. I don't think that's going to matter much. I think that Tony Blair will do his best as president and of the EU, and he's going to sit there while they raise Britain's contribution to the EU over his objections. So that's not going to happen, but it's not going to matter. This project is irreversible until, and if this may happen someday, until the common currency, which is a very strange economic construct, implodes. That might happen. It might happen because you don't have a common fiscal policy and you don't have a common harmonized tax policy. That could happen. But otherwise, this will roll on. This is a fact of life, and it's seen as the latest variant is that they can become a counterweight to the United States because although they won't spend more on military because that would interfere with the welfare state, they will forge an alliance with China. China will carry the military burden of the rival superpower, and the EU will, I don't know what it will do, but it will be friendly to China. But that's the new formulation, and that's going to go on and on.
Let me just add, I mean, one word, because the European issue is so interesting. I think, I mean, it seems to, I think it could get derailed in various ways, actually, one of them being an economic, problem with the euro, but things happen that one doesn't expect, as the murder of Van Gogh in Holland suggests, and the reaction to that. It seems to me this is one reason I think it could be there could be a neoconservative moment in Europe over the next few years, is that it seems to me people are losing faith to some degree in the sort of politically correct, this is the inheritance of Jean Monnet, modernity requires us to have ever more integration and cede everything to Brussels, and, the kind of that version of the European project. On the other hand, simply being anti-Europe is not tenable, I don't think, in most of the European nations, and maybe even in Britain, simply being Eurosceptic is getting harder and harder, even if the Constitution is defeated. Practically speaking, the ties are very deep. Certainly, and I don't think one should minimize, I will say this as someone who's not well disposed temperamentally to the EU and to the project, but one shouldn't minimize the extent to which real people on the ground in Eastern and Central Europe or in places like Spain and Portugal believe that the EU does help cement democratization in these countries, and I pay some respect to that feeling of they're the ones there, and they want an EU accession, and they want close ties to the EU, and I think that has to be taken seriously, which is why I do think there's a potentially a moment for some fresh thinking and sort of neoconservative thinking, which tries to get beyond a sort of, let's say, Jean Monnet on the one hand and Enoch Powell on the other, to sort of caricature these two sides. And I think that's happening, actually, and I do think there are an awful lot of bumps in the road. One of them, conceivably being the economic issues, demographic issues. Turkey accession is just a huge, which I admire the EU for the Commission for resolving to do, but that's the idea of Turkey acceding to a closely run from Brussels Europe is really a big problem, and I think the more they think about the benefits they're going to get, which I think they will if they can pull off Turkey's accession, the more they also have to rethink their internal organization. So I think it's an interesting, perhaps a more fluid moment for Europe and for the European project than we're accustomed to. Erwin is absolutely right. At every stage in the past, there have been people who said, well, this is it. Now they're really going to have a problem. There's really popular resistance at this level. The Germans will never give up the Deutschmark. I've heard, how many times did we hear that in 1999, 2000? And at each stage, the elites have just trundled along and actually gotten popular accession or acquiescence and support when necessary. Sometimes with very close margins in France in the vote on Maastricht. But I do think this could be an interesting moment over the next few years, and maybe a time for some fresh and dare I say, neoconservative thinking.
This, by the way, from the guy who is alleged to have told the then president of the EU, Mr. Prodi, who explained in some detail at this alleged dinner how they were reorganizing the European Commission. Bill is alleged, I say alleged, because everybody who was there told me that Mr. Prodi, you have to understand something. Europe is irrelevant to the 21st century.
May I just suggest to someone sympathetic to neoconservatism that the discussion on the European project so far reveals that neoconservatism isn't even beginning to come to terms with it, either internally or externally. Internally, when Bertolioni was here himself, he is, of course, a strong European federalist.
John, it will be impossible for Ken to summarize this, so why don't you just grab a mic? Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I was just saying that this discussion reveals the way that neoconservatism is not even beginning to come to terms with the European project, internally or externally. Internally, when Bertolioni was here himself, as a strong European federalist, he himself admitted that the institutional political culture of Europe was very hostile to traditional ideas of large swathes of the population, and yet the only solution he could suggest was that the German Christian Democrats might win the election, which, you know, is sort of inadequate. And if I can just suggest in response to what both of you have just said, what you're seeing the development of a power that is anti-American in its structure and intentions. And the most you can say about it is to wait for something to turn up. And indeed, the most distinguished neoconservative commentator on foreign policy, Bob Kagan, has adopted a policy, has proposed an argument, which I would suggest might be called capitulationism, which more or less says, well, you know, the wrong guys have won in Europe, so why don't we just accept the fact and get on with letting them be diplomats while we, you know, police the harder portions of the world. Now, if that's the solution to a major foreign policy challenge, it doesn't seem to me to be a realistic one in the long term, however realistic it is in the short.
Well, I mean,
with apologies to the C-SPAN people who got a wonderful picture of the back of your hairdo.
Well, let me say a word about, look, this is a much more complicated debate. I'm not sure how much we differ and how much Bob Kagan's different. Europeans will decide the future of Europe, and that's a fact. We can make our preferences known, or we might choose to be more, I myself think we've been foolishly preferring more integration when at least we should be agnostic, and John, you might argue we should be more actively and diplomatically hostile to integration. I am less fearful of a united Europe, I think, than you are, and I don't, you know, I think they can go in directions that I personally would prefer that they not go, and as a friend of Europe think will not be, you know, suitable to the greatness of Europe, but I don't know that it will fundamentally damage American foreign policy quite as much as you worry. I mean, I think we can have a pretty safe and satisfactory world with a very integrated Europe. I don't believe they're going to be an ally of China. I don't believe they can cause fundamental problems, frankly, for us around the world. I think they can be an annoyance, which I prefer they not be, and I think they could help much more than they will help if they go in the direction that you and I both hope they don't. But look, insofar as you're saying that people haven't really thought through, I think it's mostly for Europeans to think through, but haven't really thought through the alternatives in the current moment. I agree with that. But I do think, the good news I would say is that I don't think Bob is, but I'm certainly not for capitulating to anyone. And I think there are lots of alternatives actually out there in Europe. And you know, if Bertolioni said what you said, I very much agree, incidentally. The notion that if the CDU won in various countries, it would fundamentally change things is ridiculous, I think. But in a way, the fact that he said that also shows that we shouldn't underestimate the power of European thinking, even among those who one might think culturally would be most hostile to the event. But the one thing we've learned, I mean, is, and this is a neoconservative point, I think, it's even a conservative point, and the contingency of history We really should remember that. I mean, these things all look inevitable. Everything looks inevitable until, the day it suddenly collapses, and then it's not inevitable, and then everyone writes the histories for the next 10, 20 years about, oh, of course it was going to collapse. Communism, are you kidding? That was just doomed, and it didn't look that doomed in 1979 or 1983, and I don't know you never know what moment you're in, but I do think that in general the alternatives for Europe, including some very bad and nasty alternatives, I would say, in fact, when one really looks at the reactions to, to